My name is Helen Morrison, and for most of my life, I believed that having a good name was enough to keep you safe. I am 78 years old, born and raised in Ohio, in a town where people still nod at each other in grocery store aisles, and where your last name carries more weight than your credit score ever did. I grew up believing that reputation was something you guarded quietly, by paying your bills on time, by not asking for what you hadn't earned, by keeping your word even when no one was watching. My parents taught me that. My husband lived by it, and I tried to pass it on, even when the world started changing faster than my beliefs could keep up. I spent 42 years working as an administrative assistant for a manufacturing company just outside Dayton. It wasn't glamorous work: filing, scheduling, payroll paperwork, endless forms. But I was good at it, careful, precise. The kind of person managers relied on when numbers didn't add up and no one wanted mistakes traced back to them. When I retired, I did it cleanly. No debt, no drama. A modest pension, a small savings account I had built slowly, paycheck by paycheck, without ever borrowing against my future. My house, a 2-bedroom ranch with a faded blue door, was paid off 5 years before my husband passed. I stayed there alone after he died, not because it was easy, but because it was familiar, because every corner of that house held proof that my life had been real. I don't live extravagantly. I shop with lists. I cut coupons, not because I need to, but because old habits don't disappear just because technology says they should. I keep my paperwork organized in labeled folders. I still balance my checkbook by hand. I like knowing where things stand. Or at least I thought I did. The first sign that something was wrong arrived quietly, disguised as a mistake. It was a letter from a bank I had never used. The envelope looked official: thick paper, neat print, my full name typed carefully on the front. Inside was a notice thanking me for opening a new line of credit and reminding me of my first payment due date. I remember reading it twice, then a third time, slowly. There was an account number. There was a balance. There was a signature that looked like my name, but wasn't written by my hand. I assumed it was an error. That's what people like me do first. We give the benefit of the doubt. We assume systems glitch, that someone typed the wrong name, that things can be fixed with a phone call and patience. So I called the number listed at the bottom of the page. After 20 minutes on hold, a young man answered, cheerful and distracted. "I'm calling because I received a letter about a loan," I said, "but I didn't open any loan." He asked for my name, my date of birth, my address. Then he paused. "Well, ma'am," he said, "according to our records, the account was opened online last month." "I don't bank online," I replied. Another pause. "It shows your name, social security number, and address were used." My stomach tightened. "That's not possible," I said. "I never authorized anything like that." He sighed, not unkindly, but impatiently, the way people do when they think you simply don't understand how things work anymore. "Sometimes family members help older customers with applications," he said. "Is it possible someone assisted you?" Assisted. The word sat heavy between us. "No," I said firmly. "No one assisted me. I did not open this account." He gave me a case number, told me to file a dispute, explained it could take weeks to investigate, and reminded me, gently but clearly, that payments were still due until the matter was resolved. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread open in front of me, my tea untouched and growing cold. Something felt wrong, not just inconvenient, but invasive, as if someone had walked into my home while I was sleeping and rearranged my life without asking. Over the next 2 weeks, more letters arrived. Another bank, then a credit card company, then a notice from a lender I recognized, one I had intentionally avoided for years. Each envelope carried my name. Each balance was higher than the last. Each signature looked closer to mine, but never quite right. I started to feel watched. I pulled out my credit report for the first time in my life, and that's when the ground truly shifted beneath me. There were loans listed I had never taken, Accounts opened in cities I had never visited, payments missed, balances climbing. My credit score, something I had protected for decades without ever thinking about it, was collapsing under the weight of decisions I had never made, and every single one of them was tied to my name. I called my daughter first, not because I suspected her, but because fear makes you reach for familiar voices. She sounded surprised, concerned, sympathetic. "That's awful, Mom," she said. "You should call the banks." "I have," I replied. "They say it's real. They say someone used my information." She hesitated. "Well, identity theft happens a lot now," she said. "You know how easy it is to get information online." I knew that. But something about the way she said it felt too practiced, too quick. I called my grandson next. He worked in tech. He'd always been good with computers. He listened quietly, then said, "You probably clicked on something, Grandma, a phishing email or something." "I don't click on emails," I said. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "A lot of people don't realize they did." That word again, people, not me. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying my routines in my head, every letter I opened, every website I visited, every form I filled out. I searched for the moment I had been careless. I didn't find one. Instead, something else began to take shape. The loans weren't random. They weren't small. They weren't spread out. They were strategic.
Cash advances, personal loans, short-term approvals. The kind of borrowing someone makes when they need money quickly and don't plan on paying it back. And every lender had one thing in common. They approved the loans because my credit history was spotless, because my name meant something, because someone knew exactly whose identity to use. I sat alone in my quiet Ohio kitchen as dawn crept through the window, and a realization settled in that made my chest ache. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. And this wasn't something that could be fixed with patience. Someone had used my name like a tool, and whoever it was believed I wouldn't fight back. Not because I was wrong, but because I was old. And as the sun rose over a town that still trusted in good names and quiet lives, I understood something I had never needed to understand before. If I didn't act quickly, the life I had built would be dismantled piece by piece, legally, financially, and without mercy. And that was only the beginning. I didn't confront anyone right away. That was the first decision I made after the police officer handed my papers back to me and told me, gently but firmly, that what I was describing sounded like identity theft. The word felt heavy in my mouth. Identity. Theft. As if someone hadn't just taken money, but had reached inside my life and tried to wear it like a coat. I went home that afternoon and sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd paid bills for decades, where I'd balanced checkbooks by hand long before online banking existed. The sun came in through the lace curtains, casting familiar patterns on the wood. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. I spread the papers out slowly. Loan notices, past due warnings, a credit report printed at the library that morning. My name appeared again and again, typed neatly at the top of documents I had never seen before. Personal loans, store credit, a car loan application in a city I hadn't visited in over 15 years. It was all under my name, and none of it was mine. What unsettled me most wasn't the money. I had lived modestly my entire life. I knew how to survive with little. What unsettled me was the familiarity of the handwriting on one of the forms. A signature that tried very hard to look like mine. The same looping capital letter, the same hesitation before the last name. Someone who knew me had done this. That realization settled in my chest like cold stone. Over the next few days, I moved quietly. I called banks. I froze accounts. I placed fraud alerts. I wrote down names, times, case numbers. I listened as representatives apologized with rehearsed sympathy, assuring me they would look into it. Some believed me immediately. Others sounded skeptical, as if an older woman discovering fraud was simply confused by modern systems. I let them talk. I had learned something important over the years. People reveal more when they think you're harmless. One call in particular stayed with me.
A loan officer from a small credit union in Dayton asked me to confirm details of an application. "Ma'am, the applicant listed her emergency contact as her nephew," he said. My breath caught. I asked him to repeat the name. It was Daniel, my sister's son, the boy I'd helped raise after his father left, the one who used to mow my lawn in the summers, the one I trusted enough to let stay in my spare room when he needed a fresh start. I ended the call politely, thanked the man for his time, hung up. Then I sat very still. I thought back over the past 2 years. Daniel borrowing my car just for a few days. Daniel offering to help me set up online banking because it's safer that way. Daniel insisting on handling paperwork when my eyesight began to strain in the evenings. Daniel telling me not to worry about receipts, telling me I was overthinking things. I had mistaken familiarity for loyalty. The police officer I'd spoken to earlier called me back that week. He asked if I had any idea who might have access to my personal information. I told him the truth, carefully, completely. He didn't sound surprised. "This happens more often than people think," he said, "especially with relatives." Relatives. The word stung more than any accusation. An officer came by my apartment 2 days later to take a formal statement. He sat across from me, notebook open, listening as I explained everything. He asked clear, respectful questions. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "We'll open an investigation," he said, "but I need you to understand something. Once this starts, it won't stay quiet." I met his eyes. "I'm done being quiet," I said. After he left, I stood by the window and watched the street below. Children rode bikes. A couple argued softly on the corner. Life moved forward, unaware that my own family line had just fractured in a way it might never fully repair. That evening, my phone rang. "Daniel." I didn't answer. He called again the next day, left a message this time. "Aunt Margaret, hey, I heard you were asking around about some accounts. I think there's been a mix-up. We should talk." Mix-up. I deleted the message. What he didn't know was that the police already had copies of the loan applications. They had IP addresses, security footage from one bank branch, a timeline that showed applications being submitted late at night from locations nowhere near my home. He had used my name, but he had left his own fingerprints everywhere. A week later, the officer returned. He told me they'd spoken to Daniel, that he'd denied everything at first, that he'd claimed I'd given permission, that he'd said I was forgetful and confused. The officer looked uncomfortable when he told me that. "I'm sorry he said that," he added. I nodded. "I'm not," I replied. "He said it because he thought it would work." The investigation moved faster after that. More institutions came forward. More accounts surfaced. The total amount made my head spin, not because I couldn't comprehend it, but because I finally understood the scale of betrayal. This wasn't desperation. It was entitlement. One afternoon, while the case was still unfolding, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Daniel. He apologized, not for the theft, but for misunderstandings. He asked me to reconsider involving the police. He reminded me of family, of everything we'd been through. He wrote that I was ruining his future. I read the letter twice, then I folded it neatly and placed it in the folder I'd labeled evidence. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't heartbroken. I was clear. For the first time since this began, I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you stop questioning your own reality and start trusting it instead. They had used my name for loans, and now they would answer for it. Not to me, to the law. And that, I knew, was only the beginning. I didn't go to the police right away. That might sound strange to anyone listening, but if you've lived as long as I have, you learn that calling the authorities is never the first instinct. The first instinct is to doubt yourself, to ask whether you misunderstood something, to wonder if you misplaced a paper, forgot a conversation, signed something you shouldn't have. That was exactly what they were counting on. After the second letter arrived, this one marked "Final Notice" in bold red ink, I laid everything out on my dining table, not in a panic, but with the kind of careful focus that had carried me through decades of balancing checkbooks and household budgets. There were 3 different lenders, 3 different loan amounts, 3 different signatures, all with my name, none with my consent. What chilled me wasn't just the debt, it was the precision. Whoever did this hadn't been sloppy. They had my full legal name, my date of birth, my previous address from years ago. They knew which accounts I'd closed, which ones I'd kept. They even knew which lender I'd once used to refinance my car, a detail I hadn't mentioned to anyone in over a decade. This wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been close enough to observe my life quietly. That night, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of the money, but because of what it represented. Someone had looked at my age, my routine, my trust, and decided I was safe to exploit. The next morning, I called the first lender listed on the notice. I remember the man's voice on the other end of the line, young, polite, tired. "Ma'am, according to our records, you applied online." "I did not," I said calmly. "Well, the application includes your information, your signature, and a verified email." "Which email?" I asked. There was a pause. Typing.
"It appears to have been submitted from within Ohio." "I live in Ohio," I said. Another pause. "But not from my house." Silence. "I'm going to note this as a potential fraud case," he said carefully, "but you'll need to file a police report to move forward." There it was, the moment I'd been avoiding. After I hung up, I sat in my living room and looked around. The same armchair I'd sat in while reading bedtime stories. The same rug where my grandchildren had played with blocks. The same quiet space where I'd believed my name was safe. I realized something then, something sharp and undeniable. If I didn't act, this wouldn't stop. And if I tried to handle it quietly, it would only get worse. So I put on my coat, gathered every document I had, and drove to the police station. The building was older than I expected. Brick exterior, heavy glass doors, the kind of place that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. When I stepped inside, the officer at the front desk looked up, surprised, not because I was there, but because I didn't look confused, shaken, or apologetic. "I need to report identity theft," I said. He nodded, reached for a form, then paused. "Who's the victim?" he asked. "I am." Something about the way I said it made him look at me more carefully. I spent the next hour telling my story, slowly, clearly, without exaggeration. I laid out the letters, the loan numbers, the dates, the signatures. I explained how long I'd lived at my address, who had access to my personal information, who didn't. The officer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, "this isn't small." I nodded. "I know." "We'll open an investigation," he continued, "and we'll contact the lenders directly. But I need to ask you something." I waited. "Is there anyone in your life who might have benefited from these loans?" The question landed exactly where it was meant to. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was already forming, not as a suspicion, but as a pattern I could no longer ignore. Over the past year, one person had been asking unusual questions, casual questions, questions disguised as concern. "Do you still use the same bank? Do you get mail at your old address too? Do you remember your credit score?" Questions I'd answered without thinking, without protecting myself, because they'd come from family. I told the officer the name. He wrote it down without reacting. "All right," he said, "we'll take it from here." As I left the station, the sky over Ohio was gray and low, pressing down on the buildings like a held breath. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. For the first time since the letters arrived, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt steady, because I had finally done the one thing they didn't expect. I hadn't argued, I hadn't begged, I hadn't tried to fix it quietly. I had stepped aside and let the law speak for me. And soon, the person who used my name so carelessly was going to learn something important. Borrowing money is easy, but borrowing someone else's identity comes with consequences. I thought that once the police were involved, things would move quickly, that justice, having finally been invited into my life, would knock loudly and announce itself. I was wrong. What followed was waiting. Weeks where nothing seemed to happen on the surface. Weeks where letters still arrived, calls still came, and my name continued to appear in places it had never belonged. The lenders had been notified, the accounts flagged, but the damage had already been done. My credit was frozen. My savings were locked in a kind of administrative limbo. Every purchase, every bill, every routine expense now required explanation. For the first time in my life, I had to prove I was innocent of things I had never done. The most exhausting part wasn't the paperwork. It was the tone, the subtle disbelief in voices on the phone, the careful way representatives asked the same questions again and again, as if repetition might expose a lie. Are you sure you didn't authorize this? Could someone have misunderstood your permission? Is it possible you forgot signing something? Forgot. That word followed me everywhere. I began to understand something deeply unsettling. The system was not built for people like me. It was built for speed, for digital trails, for confident voices that spoke quickly and didn't hesitate. Age, caution, and precision, the things that had protected me my entire life, now worked against me. Still, I complied. I documented everything. I sent certified letters. I logged calls. I learned new words: affidavit, dispute, provisional credit. I kept going, not because I trusted the process, but because stopping would mean surrendering my name entirely. Daniel tried again. This time he showed up at my house. I saw his car from the window, the same one he'd bought 2 years earlier, around the same time the first unauthorized loan had been opened. The connection was no longer subtle. I didn't open the door right away. I stood in the hallway, listening as he knocked. Not hard, not desperate, just enough to remind me of familiarity, of shared history, of the leverage he thought he still had. "Aunt Helen," he called, "please, I just want to talk." Talk. That word had been used to excuse too much already. When I finally opened the door, I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, the chain still on. "You shouldn't have gone to the police," he said immediately, frustration slipping through his voice. "This could have been handled privately." "Privately?" I asked. "Like the loans?" He flinched. "I was going to fix it," he insisted, once things stabilized. "Stabilized for whom?" I asked. He looked past me into the house, as if searching for something familiar to anchor himself. "You don't understand how hard things have been." I almost laughed.
"I understand hardship," I said calmly. "I just never stole to survive it." His face hardened. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said. "They won't even believe you. You know how this looks." Yes, I did. And that was exactly why I had let the police handle it. "I don't need them to believe me," I said. "I need them to follow the evidence." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're ruining everything," he muttered. "No," I replied. "I'm stopping you." I closed the door. 2 days later, the officer called. They had pulled security footage from one of the banks. Daniel had gone in person to finalize paperwork, using my name and identification. He had been careful, dressed neatly, confident, prepared. But cameras are patient. They remember things people hope will be forgotten. There were timestamps. There were signatures. There were digital records tied to devices registered in his name. The case shifted from suspicion to certainty. When the officer told me they would be filing charges, my reaction surprised even me. I felt relief, not satisfaction, not triumph. Relief, because the truth no longer depended on my ability to convince anyone. It stood on its own. The court process was slow, painfully slow, but it was also methodical. Each hearing peeled back another layer of the story Daniel had tried to construct. His claims of permission dissolved under scrutiny. His insistence that I had agreed verbally meant nothing without proof. The judge listened carefully, asked precise questions, reviewed documents without rushing. For the first time since this began, I felt seen not as an inconvenience, but as a person whose life had been violated. When the ruling finally came, it was simple. The loans were declared fraudulent. My name was cleared. The debts were transferred away from me. Daniel was charged with identity theft and financial exploitation of an elder. The words sounded clinical, but their impact was anything but. I walked out of the courthouse that day into Ohio sunlight that felt sharper, cleaner somehow. The air was cold, but it didn't bite. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the weight I'd been carrying slowly lift. My name was mine again, and no one would ever use it without consequence. The case did not resolve quickly. Justice rarely does when it has to untangle years of trust and quiet assumptions.
But once the police stepped in, things began to move in ways I could finally see. 2 detectives contacted me the following week. They were calm, professional, and most importantly, thorough. They already had information I hadn't known existed, timestamps from online applications, security footage from a branch where one loan had been finalized, and a record showing where the money had gone almost immediately after it was approved. It hadn't gone toward groceries or rent. It had gone toward electronics, travel, cash withdrawals made within hours.
Someone hadn't borrowed my name to survive. They had used it to live well. The detectives explained everything carefully, never rushing me, never speaking down to me. They told me that once identity theft involves multiple financial institutions and exceeds a certain amount, it becomes more than a civil dispute. It becomes a criminal matter. I nodded as they spoke, absorbing each word with the same discipline I had used my entire life: filing, recording, understanding. One of them asked me gently, "Are you prepared for this to get difficult?" I knew what he meant. "Family," I said. He didn't deny it. "Yes," he replied. "Family cases are often the hardest." I thought about that after they left, about how easily people assume that blood protects you from harm, when in reality, it often grants the closest access. Strangers guess. Family knows. The arrest didn't happen at my home. I wasn't there when they went to Daniel's apartment. I heard about it later, through the officer who called to inform me that he had been taken in for questioning. He had denied everything at first, then changed his story when presented with evidence. Claimed confusion, claimed permission, claimed I had said it was fine. None of it held. The paperwork was clear, the timelines were precise, the signatures were analyzed, and most damning of all, the money trail led directly to him. When the officer told me, I felt something loose inside my chest. Not relief exactly, more like release. Weeks later, the lenders began contacting me again, this time with a different tone: apologetic, formal, respectful. Accounts were frozen, then removed. My credit score, slowly, carefully, began to recover. Each correction felt like a small restoration of my name, returned piece by piece. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the prosecutor's office. They thanked me for my cooperation and informed me that charges had been formally filed: identity theft, fraud, multiple counts. I set the letter down and stared out the window. It was raining lightly, the kind of Ohio rain that doesn't make noise, just presence. The street looked the same as it always had: neighbors walking dogs, a delivery truck stopping at the corner. Life continuing, indifferent to the fact that my family had changed forever. Daniel wrote to me once more after that. Another letter, longer this time, more emotional. He apologized fully now, not carefully, not strategically. He admitted what he'd done, said he hadn't thought it would go this far, said he believed I'd, quote, handle it quietly, said he never imagined I'd call the police. That line stayed with me. He never imagined I'd call the police, as if standing up for myself was unimaginable, as if my age meant compliance, silence, endurance without resistance. I folded the letter and placed it in the same folder as the others. Evidence doesn't stop being evidence just because it hurts. I never replied. The day I received confirmation that the last fraudulent account had been removed from my record, I did something simple. I drove to the cemetery where my husband was buried. I brought flowers. I sat beside his stone and told him everything, not because I believed he needed to hear it, but because saying it out loud made it real. I did the right thing, I said quietly, even when it was hard. The wind moved through the trees. The air smelled clean. For the first time since this began, I felt whole again. My name was mine, not borrowed, not abused, not rewritten by someone else's greed. Mine. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if someone has crossed a line and you've told yourself it's easy or not to make trouble, hear me now. Silence protects the wrong person. Trust does not mean surrender.
family does not mean immunity, and age does not mean weakness. They used my name for loans. I let the police handle it. And in doing so, I took back the one thing I had guarded my entire life: my identity, my dignity, my right to be believed.